chapter 18, chapter 19 go together, really giving us the account of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In chapter 18, we had Abraham showing hospitality to three visitors who we learn were the Lord was one of the visitors, and then there were two angels, and they gave the announcement concerning Sarah that in the following year that Sarah would have a child, a son who would be born to her, and we saw her reaction when she heard that news, that she was laughing about that. And then moving on from there, the Lord informed Abraham of what he intended to do to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, that he would bring destruction upon them. And Abraham then interceded with God to appeal for mercy for those who were righteous within those cities, and with starting off with, if there were 50 who were righteous, would the Lord still destroy the city if there were 50 righteous people there? And the number went down each time to finally being 10. If there were 10 righteous people in the city, God said that he would not destroy the city. And then at the end of chapter 18, the Lord went his way when he'd finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So we come to the continuation of this story in chapter 19, and we'll read here chapter 19 verses 1 to 11, which says, "The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, 'My lords, turn aside, I pray you, to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. You may rise up early and go on your way.' They said, 'No, we will spend the night in the street.' But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them.' Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, 'I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not known man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof.' But they said, 'Stand back.' And they said, 'This fellow came to sojourn, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them.' Then they pressed hard against the man, drew near to break the door. But the men put forth their hands and brought Lot into the house to them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves groping for the door." Whilst Abraham and the Lord had been speaking together, the two men who are now identified as being angels continued their journey, and they arrived at Sodom in the evening. Lot, we're told here, was sitting in the gate of the city when he saw them, and he greeted them, falling down before them. For Lot to be sitting in the gate indicates the position to which he had risen in the city. The area inside the city gate was the place where the city elders and the leading citizens met in order to conduct business, a bit like the town hall or the civics in our own day would be, where administration and various other business matters are conducted. Later on in chapter 23, when Abraham is buying a piece of land for the burial of his wife Sarah, that business is conducted at the city gates in the presence of those who were at the gate of the city. Later on also in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 8 and 19, we see the case of, in the case of a rebellious son who was to be taken before the elders at the gate of the city in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 and 19, which says, "If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, And though they chastise him, will not give heed to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of his city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. So this matter is being dealt with by the elders at the city gate. In Joshua, the book of Joshua, chapter 20 and verse 4, another reference here to the city gate. This is in connection with the cities of refuge to which a person could flee if they had accidentally killed a person there for protection. And verse 4 says, he shall flee to one of these cities and shall stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and explain his case to the elders of that city. Then they shall take him into the city and give him place. And in the book of Ruth, in Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, when Boaz is making arrangements to marry Ruth, business is taking place here at the city gate. Ruth chapter 4, verse 1 says, and Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the next of kin of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. So they conduct their business there at the city gate. And this is where we find Lot located here at the city gate, perhaps an indication that he had risen to a position of importance in the city of Sodom. Initially, Lot had pitched his tent near to Sodom back in chapter 13 and verse 12 after he and Abraham had separated. Lot had gone off in one direction and Abraham in the other. Chapter 13 verse 12 said, Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan while Lot dwelt among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So he's moving his tent closer to the city of Sodom. And then we find that he had actually moved into the city in chapter 14, verse 12. This is when he's taken captive from Sodom. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And now he is sitting in the gate of the city, and he has a house in the city as well. So he's made this transition from living in a tent outside of Sodom to actually moving in and perhaps becoming someone of prominence there at the city gate. So Lot offered these 2 men or angels hospitality, inviting them to spend the night at his house and wash their feet. This was the normal custom of courtesy and the offer of hospitality that would take place at that time. And it seems that perhaps no one other than Lot had offered these visitors this hospitality. But they declined the offer, saying that they would spend the night in the street. This is similar to an incident that occurs in the book of Judges. And the whole story, as we'll see, is quite similar to Judges in Judges chapter 19, from verse 14. This is the story of the Levite and his concubine, the Levite who had gone to Bethlehem to recover his concubine and then is making his way home, and it's late at night, and they go to the city of Gibeah, a city of the tribe of Benjamin, to spend the night there. And Judges chapter 19 verse 14 says, so they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no man took them into his house to spend the night. And then this old man who's been out in the fields comes in, and he invites this Levite into his home and offers him hospitality there. So a similar situation. We'll see there are other similarities with that story that we'll note later as well. These 2 angels then say that they'll spend the night there in the street, but Lot strongly urged them to come into his house and they finally agreed. Lot was no doubt aware of the dangers that they would face if they chose to spend the night in the street, and so out of concern for their safety, he took them to his home. Lot then made them a meal which are described as a feast, and baked unleavened bread, and they ate together. The arrival of these two visitors has come to the attention of the men of the city of Sodom, and now they all, both young and old, we're told, surround Lot's house. And they call out to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." The particular sin for which Sodom became infamous is indicated here in the demands of the men of the city. Bring them out to us that we may know them. The New International Version puts that a bit more bluntly. Bring them out so that we can have sex with them. That's what their intention is. Sodom was a city where moral depravity was rife, and that's already been indicated back in chapter 13 and verse 13. After mention has been made of Lot moving the tent towards Sodom, verse 13 says, "Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord." And the name of the city of Sodom then became synonymous with great wickedness and sinfulness, as is seen in other references to the city in some of the prophets. Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 9, where the sin of Jerusalem and Judah is likened to the sin of Sodom. Their partiality witnesses against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them, for they've brought evil upon themselves. So likening the condition of Jerusalem and Judah at that time to Sodom. And then in Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 14 as well. Jeremiah 23, verse 14. But in the prophets of Jerusalem I have seen a horrible thing. They commit adultery and walk in lies. They strengthen the hands of evildoers, so that no one turns from his wickedness. All of them have become like Sodom to me, and its inhabitants like Gomorrah. And then in Ezekiel as well, Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. This is drawing a comparison between Judah and Israel and their sinfulness. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, sufficed of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me, therefore I removed them when I saw it. And then in the New Testament, in the letter of Jude, verse 7, speaking again of God's judgment and giving various illustrations of God's judgment here, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise acted immorally and indulged in unnatural lust, served as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So the name of Sodom becomes synonymous with sinfulness and great wickedness. But Lot courageously went out to talk to these men who were surrounding his house and begged them not to act so wickedly. He addressed the men here as my brothers, indicating his identity with them, that he's part of that community. And shockingly, he even offered them his 2 virgin daughters so that they could do to them whatever they pleased. Again, this is similar to that story we mentioned from Judges chapter 19, verses 22 to 26, where the story goes on there, and it's quite a disturbing account that is given here in Judges chapter 19, that this Levite and his concubine have gone into this man's house for hospitality. And as they're making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, base fellows, beset the house round about, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brethren, do not act so wickedly, seeing that this man has come into my house. Do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let them bring them out now, ravish them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man do not do so vile a thing. So it's similar situation there in Judges to the one we have here in Sodom as well. So as far as Lot is concerned here, these two men have come under his roof, and he is to protect them, he is to look after them. And so rather than allow them to be harmed in any way, he's willing to give his two daughters to the mob outside his house. Lot considered his obligation to protect his guests greater than his obligation to protect his own daughters. And it's something that it sounds shocking to us today, but this is how it was then. The mob, though, reject Lot's offer, and they tell him to stand back. As an outsider, they say of him, this fellow came to sojourn. Now, he's just a visitor. He's just someone who's come as an outsider, and he has no right to judge them, they say. And so they threaten then to deal with Lot worse than they intended to do with his visitors. So this great crowd then pressed against Lot, and it seemed that the door of the house was about to break down when these two visitors, the two angels, pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. And the two angels then struck with blindness the men who were gathered outside the door, and they wore themselves out, we're told, trying to find the door. So their blindness seemed in some way to disorientate them, so that they could not find the door to the house. Moving on, verses 12 to 14 here. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. The angels asked Lot then if he had any other family members there in the city, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, any other relatives. And they should, if so, they should leave the city, because they are about to destroy it. They tell Lot that the outcry against the city has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has them to destroy the city. So they tell Lot plainly here what their purpose is and what the Lord intends to do to the city. And it seems that Lot took their message seriously. He's already seen a demonstration of their power in them striking all the men around the house with blindness. And so Lot went out to warn his sons-in-law, who are betrothed to his daughters, and said to them, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. However, his sons-in-law thought that he was jesting, that this was just some sort of joke, and they didn't take the warning seriously. So they are left there in the city. But verses 15 to 23 then continues the story here. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, arise, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him forth and set him outside the city. When they had brought them forth, they said, "Flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Flee to the hills, lest you be consumed." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favour in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot flee to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, yonder city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there, is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favour also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Make haste, escape there, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. So at dawn, the angels urged Lot to leave the city with his wife and his 2 daughters, fearing that they too would be consumed when the city was punished and destroyed. But despite this warning, Lot was not in any great hurry to leave. We're told here that he lingered. He hung around for some reason. We've seen in recent months and weeks, really, the people having to flee their homes in Ukraine because of the war there, and most recently in Sudan because of the fighting going on there, and the urgency that people have in these situations of having to get out of danger. And this is what the angels are urging upon Lot here, that they need to get out, they need to hurry. But Lot, we're told, lingered, and we don't know why. We're not told why he lingered here. And so the angels then seized Lot, his wife and daughters, by their hands and really forcibly set them outside of the city. And in doing this, the Lord was being merciful to Lot and his family. When they were outside of the city, the angels urged Lot and his family to flee for their lives, saying, "Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Flee to the hills, lest you be consumed." So the situation is urgent. You need to get out of here as quickly as possible. You need to get as far away as possible. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just keep going. Get there. Even now, Lot is still dithering. He's grateful that they've shown him this favour and this great kindness in saving his life. But he says he cannot flee to the mountains. He's afraid that the disaster would overtake him and he would die, perhaps thinking, well, I can't move quickly enough to stay ahead of this disaster that's coming. And so he asks them if he could be allowed to escape to a small nearby city and be saved there instead. And Lot is granted this favour also. He's allowed to flee to this little city which will not be overthrown. But he is told here to make haste, escape there, for I can do nothing till you arrive there. And the name of the city that Lot flees to was Zoar. That's a word that means little. Its original name had been Bela. In chapter 14, verse 2, it's mentioned there. Chapter 14, verse 2 refers to these kings who were in this alliance against the kings of Sodom and these other cities, Zoar being one of them. So verse 2, the end of verse 2 mentions the king of Bela, and in brackets, that is Zoar. So the name meaning this little city. And then by the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun, we're told, had risen on the earth. So it's early in the morning when he finally arrives there at that little city. Reading on then, verses 24 to 29, it says, "Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the valley, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. Well, now that Lot has arrived safely in Zoar, the Lord is able to act, and brimstone and fire, we're told, came from the Lord out of heaven and rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah. And those cities and the entire valley and the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation, it was all destroyed. Lot had chosen to live in this region because it was a good, fertile land. That was the basis of his choice back in chapter 13 and verse 10, which mentions there when he and Abraham part company, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. That was how it had been, but now it's all been destroyed. The valley where the cities were located was called the Valley of Sodom, or the Salt Sea, and it's mentioned in chapter 14, verse 3, and verse 10 of chapter 14 mentions that there were bitumen pits in this area. So chapter 14, verse 3 says, all these joined forces in the Valley of Sodom, that is the Salt Sea. And then verse 10 says, now the Valley of Sodom was full of bitumen pits. So the bitumen pits may have contributed to this great destruction that occurred, this destruction by fire, that the bitumen would have fueled that fire there. Lot's wife is mentioned here. She's behind Lot, making their escape, but she ignored the warning that had been given not to look back. We're not told why she looked back. Perhaps she wanted a final glance back at her old life. But when she did so, she became a pillar of salt, we're told. And so her disobedience was immediately punished. This is something that Jesus refers to in Luke chapter 17, verses 28 to 32, when he's speaking about the coming of the Son of Man. In Luke chapter 17 from verse 28, speaking of the days of the Son of Man coming, likewise as it was in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day let him who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away, and likewise let him who is in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Jesus reminding the people there of that incident, to remember Lot's wife when she looked back and became this pillar of salt. Early in the morning of the destruction, then Abraham returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord to intercede for Sodom back in chapter 18. And from there, from that position, he was able to look down towards the valley to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was able to witness for himself this scene of devastation. He saw the smoke going up like the smoke of a furnace. And in the destruction of these cities, we're told that God remembered Abraham and saved Lot. So it was for Abraham's sake that Lot was saved when the Lord overthrew the cities. Lot is mentioned by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 to 9. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6. Peter is talking here about how God is able to spare the godly, and he refers to Noah in the previous verse, and then in verse 6, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes he condemned them to extinction and made them an example to those who were to be ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the licentiousness of the wicked, for by what that righteous man saw and heard as he lived among them, he was vexed in his righteous soul day after day with their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trial. Peter refers there to Lot's righteousness. He mentions righteous Lot, who was greatly distressed by the wickedness that he saw in the city. And that's something that perhaps doesn't come out really in the account that we have here in Genesis chapter 19, but that's Peter's interpretation of that. Well, verses 30 to 38, the final verses of the chapter, provide us with a postscript to the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, concerning Lot and his two daughters now. They're the only survivors from the city. Verse 30 says, now Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. So he dwelt in a cave with his two daughters, and the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. And on the next day the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So Lot, then we learn, had left the city of Zoar, where he had initially fled, and he went with his daughters to the hills, where they had originally been told to flee, and they're now living in a cave. So from sitting in the gate of Sodom, Lot has ended up here living in a cave. And the daughters were concerned now that they had no husbands, and being childless, the family line would die out. And so they devised a desperate scheme to keep the family line alive. They would get their father drunk, and then they would lie with him so that offspring would be preserved and the family line would continue. This is action done out of desperation, really. It's a great need for the family line to continue. So the first night they got their father drunk with wine, and the eldest daughter went in and slept with him. And the second night the younger daughter did the same. And in his drunken state, Lot was unaware of what had happened. And verse 36 there bluntly states the consequences. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. And when the children were born, the eldest daughter had a son named Moab. The name means from my father, or from the father. And the youngest daughter had a son named Ben-Ami, meaning son of my kinsman. So the meaning of the names is suggestive there of the circumstances of their births. And these two sons then became the fathers of the Moabite and the Ammonite peoples. So we're provided here with the origin of those people, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who in later years became implacable enemies of Israel and caused Israel many problems. The text does not pass any moral judgment on what Lot's daughters did here. It simply records what happened, and perhaps it depicts this rather tragic end to Lot's life and shows that the choices that we make sometimes have many unimaginable and far-reaching consequences. And this is the end of Lot's story. He's not mentioned again in the book of Genesis. This is the final time that he is mentioned, and so it's rather a tragic end to his story that we have here. So that brings us to the end of chapter 19, and a few questions perhaps to think about or to reflect upon from this chapter. How does this chapter illustrate the mercy and the justice of God? What do we see in that chapter that indicates the mercy of God and the justice, the fairness of God? How would you assess the actions and the character of Lot? He's quite a complicated character, and we see what Peter says about him in his letter, describing him as being righteous. But we perhaps don't see that side of his character in the Genesis account, though. And is there anything in this chapter that troubles you, that disturbs you in some way? Some of these things that have been going on that we've been looking at this evening. So there's a few things perhaps to think about from this chapter.